Please give a warm welcome to Gregory Rodriguez.
Hello. The premise of this evening is simply a provocation. The 90s were rough. There were riots, there was an earthquake, the AIDS crisis, Proposition 187 was brutal. It was really rough. And I wanted to go back then on one level and then to talk about, but the reaction to the roughness was pretty extraordinary as well. There was a sense of resilience in the air. There was a sense of commitment. There was also a huge departure. We lost about 600,000 Anglos in the LA County in the 90s. People who said, screw this, I'm out. But those who stayed, stayed. And those who came right after, stayed. And it really sort of weeded people out in many ways. And part of this is I hate to think this is entirely me looking at some through the middle-aged gauzy lens, but there was this sense of vitality to the era, and I'm wondering if we're missing that, or maybe we just don't need it anymore, and we're just a much better place. So I want to start with I don't really believe that, but I want to start with let's go back and talk about my personal recollections of the 90s and what connects each of you to the 90s in Los Angeles, and start with you. Harold? Geez, I have to introduce you fellows.
Yeah, really.
I don't usually moderate Zócalo events. With me are pretty amazing assemblage of panelists. To my immediate left, Harold Meyerson. Harold Meyerson is the executive editor of the American Prospect and an op-ed contributor to the Los Angeles Times. He was previously an op-ed columnist for the Washington Post and the executive editor of the LA Weekly. To his left, Helen Molesworth. Helen Molesworth is the chief curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, MOCA, right here in Los Angeles. To her left is Dr. Todd Boyd. Dr. Boyd is a race and pop culture scholar at USC's School of Cinematic Arts and the author of several books, including the notorious PhD's Guide to the Superfly 70s. And to his left, Fernando Guerra. Fernando Guerra is a political scientist and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount University. Please give them all a warm welcome. So as I mentioned, I'm hoping that you can all sort of connect us to the 90s personally, however many vignettes you want to give to the moments of the 90s that you recall. Harold.
Well, shortly after the '92 Rodney King riots, Anna Deavere Smith was working on one of those plays where she gets many voices and then does those many voices, reflecting on the city of LA. And I was one of the gazillion and 6 people she interviewed for that. I remember her being in my office at the LA Weekly asking me what I thought about the crisis, and my immediate response was, which one? LA in the early 90s, as Gregory suggested, had so many iconic disasters that it's hard to recount them all. I mean, my personal memories include on the first night of the Rodney King riots, I was, good journalist that I am, at First AME Church, watching Tom Bradley trying to hold his city together unsuccessfully. And as you're sitting in the church, you can hear explosions outside, cars being torched, other things. And then at the conclusion of the event, Tom Bradley's staff was trying to figure out a way, how the hell to get this guy who'd been mayor of LA for 20 years, kind of a completely iconic figure, safely out of the building. They were really concerned. He kind of ended up sort of crouching in almost kind of a Groucho Marx lope but between the building and his car. The early 90s were really pretty amazing. LA lost, as Gregory suggested, a huge number of longtime, chiefly Anglo residents. I started writing in the LA Weekly in the early 90s a line that I have since, for worse, not for better and worse, just for worse, now describes the entire American economy. What I said about LA at the time was that the bottom is not falling out of our economy, the middle is. Aerospace collapsed at the end of the Cold War. That was a significant part of the recession that ultimately helped cost the senior George Bush his job. Aerospace companies around LA County were the largest single private sector employers up through then. They sort of fell off the map. And with them, a whole slew of unionized production and professional engineering jobs. Really, the middle just falling out. Meanwhile, the city proved amazingly adept at creating what economists call shit jobs for the huge number of immigrants who were coming into LA. So it was really quite something. One statistic I do remember. Most of the national economy began to recover from the recession of the early 90s fairly quickly. Not so LA, and it got to the point where around 1994 and 1985, I recall that 1 out of 8 unemployed Americans lived in Southern California. Well, you know, come on. 1 out of 8 Americans don't live in Southern California, but 1 out of 8 unemployed Americans did. Median income in LA, the first half of the 90s, just plummeted. A friend of mine.
I want to get back to personal.
Well, I'm depressing them.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes,
you're interrupting my depressing them.
Fernando, ground us through your eyes, through your experience, through your life in LA in the 90s.
Well, like every major city, you're going to have pockets of prosperity and you know, pockets of poverty and experiences. On a personal level, the 90s were obviously great for me. I had young children, they grew, they prospered. I got tenure, I published, I bought a home. So the 90s from a personal level were very good to me. But from, taking a look at my beloved Los Angeles, it was, the first half was horrendous. And then the second half was a comeback in a variety of different things that happened that today continue to really help structure what Los Angeles is. Like Harold said, we began the decade with a recession, the worst recession since World War II until this great recession that we had. A real estate downturn. I bought a house for $250,000 in 1989, which would have been, if you had pinpointed the worst time to buy a house, that's the month I bought it. And within a year, I was, that house was worth like $185, and I'm like, what am I gonna do? And eventually ended up selling that house for $600,000. Typical LA real estate story, right? So real estate downturn, a recession, the deindustrialization of Los Angeles. Then you get the riots in '92, the great fires of '93. People forget that we had these incredible fires that just seemed to come. It was just a national story. The earthquake in '94, OJ in '95. Things were so bad that the Raiders would rather be in Oakland than in LA, and they moved in '95. And that's really that first half of that decade. It was just one thing after another, with a loss of population in terms of and whole neighborhoods changing dramatically. My personal recollection about the riots: April 29th, 24 years ago, this week. That morning, I was actually at 32nd Street Elementary School, a traditionally African-American elementary school. I had a former student who was a teacher there, and they were celebrating something or another, and they asked me to go lecture. And believe me, man, the worst thing to do is to try to lecture to kindergartners and first graders. Nothing is easier than doing this compared to that. And so I dreaded that. And I went there, and the classroom was half African-American, half Latino, and we talked about that. And getting back in the car, stopping on Normandy and Florence on my way back to Lower Marymount. I'm on that corner. Everything looked great. The sun was awesome. It was great weather. It was great to be alive, great to be in Los Angeles. And that was at noon, Later that afternoon, that was the epicenter of what was happening. And then remember climbing to the roof of my house and watching the fires everywhere. It was also final exams at Loyola Marymount University, going back and the students basically saying, the world is falling apart around us, and you have taught us nothing to prepare us for this. We're about to graduate, and we're completely unprepared to do this. And that was the genesis of starting the Center for the Study of Los Angeles, to say that we need to make and produce people to be activists, and not just in a theoretical sense, but in a very practical sense. And it wasn't only Loyola Marymount University, USC, Occidental College, Cal State Northridge. We all started academic centers that focused on Los Angeles. UCLA, I always think about this even before, and I'll end with this. When I first started my academic career, and a professor at UCLA telling me that I shouldn't be so parochial to study LA, And this is a guy whose expertise was the Norwegian economy. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? And the Norwegian economy is not even the size of LA. But UCLA had that perspective, you know. And if you think about UCLA, now it has quite a few LA scholars, okay? But back then, you'd be hard pressed to find an expert on Los Angeles. Now you go to the UCLA faculty list, the USC faculty list, Occidental College, the Cal State Loyola Marymount, and there are a ton of individuals. And it begins really with, we rediscover Los Angeles as academics in the 1990s. Yeah. The proliferation of books. I mean, Harold and I were talking, you know, you try to, when you had a class in the early 90s to try to put together a syllabus, very little literature on Los Angeles. Today, it's hard to keep up with. So my other recollection of the 90s, of course, is the 1994 and Proposition 187 and the protest against that. And kind of not really participating, trying to be going along and watching, being interested and being proud of those kids and watching the Mexican flags, not thinking much about it, and then going back and watching it on TV and thinking, uh-oh,
Dr. Boyd, through your eyes and through your life and your connection to the 90s in Los Angeles.
I moved to LA in '92. I moved here officially, I think it was the end of May, beginning of June, something like that. But I had been here that January, and I was back here again that March. But for me, it's part of maybe a longer story. I'm from Detroit, and I've been in LA since '92. I have nowhere else to go. But when people ask me where I'm from, inevitably I say Detroit. That's not going to change. I love LA, but I will always be from Detroit. So I remember when I was a kid, I was watching a USC Notre Dame football game. This is back in the '70s. And, at the time, the last game of the college football season would be around Thanksgiving, not like now when, you're in the middle of January and they're still playing college football. And I'm watching USC and Notre Dame. If you know college football history, USC history, of course, this is Anthony Davis returning the second half kickoff back. And, USC winning 55-24. They were down 24 at the half. But I saw this game, and it's November in Detroit, and it's cold. It's seriously cold. It's cold in Detroit in June. It's November is another. And I'm looking at this game. I'm a young kid, and I'm these guys are in California, and the sun's shining, and people are wearing short pants, and what is this? I told myself at that moment, I was going to USC. I did. This is a true story. It took me longer to get to USC than I planned. What would that be? Almost 20 years later, I'm coming to USC as a professor. So I fulfilled this promise I had made to myself when I was 10 years old. So it was very important. But I just happened to be moving here and going to USC right after the riots. And at the time, USC looks very different now than when I started there, very different, and will look even different than that in another year or two. At the time, you could still see burnt out, the riot was tangible. You could smell it, you could see it, I made a joke to someone, about the Bloods and the Crips, and they tried to chastise me. That's not funny. We don't joke about that around here. And I'm well, you just assured yourself that there are going to be more jokes because you told me not to joke about it. Of course I have to, right? It was very tangible. So to think about the fact that I was about to look at my watch to see what the date is. It's the 28th. Tomorrow's the 29th. Ice Cube says April 29th brought power to the people, and we might just see a sequel referencing the start of the riots, April 29th, 1992. So for me, that's the beginning, and other people maybe have mentioned some of these things. Fires, I remember mudslides. I'm where in the fuck am I? Mudslides, what, Did
you miss Detroit at that point?
I always miss Detroit. mudslides, OJ, you know, the OJ, a friend of mine, Larry Karaszewski, of course, one of the people involved in creating the recent OJ piece on Fox, and we were talking about this, and I'm like, well, you know, OJ was an attraction. I had family who would come from Detroit to visit. They wanted me to take them by OJ's house. I knew Rockingham. I knew like, you know, and I have this, maybe if there's time, I can tell it later. I had this really incredible encounter with OJ himself because of this. So it's like this thing that was happening on television, this trial that was a very real trial, but it looked like fiction. It looked like what would come to be court TV. It looked like what we now call reality television was real. And if you lived here, there perhaps was some connection to it beyond seeing it on television. For me, I always marked the 90s in LA as this span personally from the riots in 92, and then of course, if you follow through with all these things we're talking about, 97, you get to the murder of Biggie Smalls at the Peterson Automotive Museum. And by that time, I had been here for 5 years, and being in LA for 5 years is significant because you meet so many people who are from so many other places. The more time you have under your belt, the more you can feel like, yes, I'm a veteran. People who are from LA, that's a whole different category. So there's a lot to think about. You mentioned the Raiders leaving, the Rams left. I'm at USC across from the Coliseum, and the next thing I know, I'm in a city, and there's the second largest city in the country. There's no NFL team. I mean, you know, there's just a lot of things to sort of think about from that time. And interestingly enough, 20 years seems to be the point when people start to recycle. And so as this recent OJ piece indicated, you know, a lot of these things from the 90s are sort of coming back to us. And so to think that we're so close to April 29th having this conversation, I think is probably part of that.
Yeah. Helen, you were not in Los Angeles. You were in New York, I believe.
I was.
But you've long had feelings for Los Angeles.
Yes. For me, LA in the 90s was all about culture. LA in the 90s is NWA. I remember I was living in San Diego at the time. I remember the needle dropping on that record like it was yesterday.
Which NWA? Not Straight Outta Compton.
Mm-hmm.
That's 88.
88, yep.
That's
but
the
that's
90s.
well, if you're going to stick all close to the numbers, that's fine. But when the needle dropped on NWA Straight Outta Compton, something shifted for me and a lot of my friends. And that was that LA was all of a sudden a place where culture was made. If you were in contemporary art like I was, you were here. You were looking at Helter Skelter. You were thinking about the emergence of people like Mike Kelly and Kathy Opie as seminal, crucial artists that had to be reckoned with. And the whole idea of LA as some other kind of place really started to diminish. It became increasingly over the decade a place you had to visit, a place you had to go to if you were interested in either contemporary music or contemporary art. And it was also the beginning for a lot of us on the other side of the country. For those of us who were trying to think about postmodernism, LA was it. Jean Baudrillard wrote about the Bonaventure Hotel, and Mike Davis wrote City of Quartz. And those essays, those books, those ideas that started to reframe Los Angeles as a kind of crucial late 20th century event were instrumental in what later became, what we only understand now is the sort of globalization of culture. But, you know, Kathy Opie's first show in New York was of the freeways, and the freeways were, that body of work was made directly in response to the Northridge earthquake, right? So even though I don't think I could have narrated the story I've just told you then, that was all accruing. And that by the time you get to, 2004, so if you bookend the 90s, generously from 88 to like 04, by '04, everyone who lives in New York understands you have to come to LA at least 2 or 3 times a year if you're going to be on top of anything in contemporary art. And now, of course, it's a completely different story, right? I mean, now LA is largely seen as a kind of central city and a central place of production for culture. But I think that really emerged for most people my generation. The birth of LA as a cultural engine is really the 1990s.
You also had a personal story flying out here after the riot.
I did. I went my last year of college. I'm a native New Yorker, so my last year of college I ended up at UCSD, and I am flipped out because Birds of Paradise, which like sell for $5 a stalk in New York, they just grow in like highway medians in San Diego. So I am walking around flipped out. I can't even believe that like I've been so naive that I did not know this place existed. And I ended up dating a boy who was from Los Angeles. And so we were coming up and down the coast all the time.
How old was he? Because you called him a boy.
We were,
I'm kidding,
we
just
were
go.
in college. And then I switched to girls, so. So they're always, you all are always boys to me.
Be careful. Be careful.
So,
Be careful.
gotta call it like I see it. So,
I hear you.
anyway.
There's a such thing called context, too.
Yeah,
That's all.
well, I'm
That's all.
talking within mine. So, anyway.
Watch yourself.
Easy now.
Greg, you wanted me to switch
Yeah.
seats?
So anyway.
Saying,
What happens is we go to New York and the news of, and we watch obviously the Rodney King beating on television, and that becomes like a major thing that has to be discussed. And that's another way in which I think LA becomes a kind of major site of cultural discourse. But when the verdict was turned in and it was clear that the proper indictment had not been delivered and the rebellion began, my boyfriend and I at the time, did what people in their 20s do. We got on the plane and flew here because all our friends were here and his parents were here. And we helped our friends clean the smoke out of their screens who lived in Koreatown. And we just generally felt the need to be here. That it was also, you might recall, it was the beginning of that kind of 24-hour news cycle. And the news felt extremely distorted. And it felt like the only way not to be scared was to actually come back and see what was actually happening. The news media at that moment, we weren't used to that kind of ridiculous, hyped up cycle now. I don't think we understood how to turn it off. So we came here, but I think the real personal story you want me to tell is we ended up at the benefit concert at the Wiltern with Fish and Los Lobos. So.
Helen had mentioned that in the 90s, LA began to be seen as a crucial late 20th century event. And you had agreed with Fernando earlier that LA began to take itself seriously. How did that happen? I mean, it took crises for us to be seen as other than La La Land? Or walk us through LA changing, LA's image changing to the world and LA's image changing to itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you said about LA being seen as, finally a producer of serious culture, let's keep in mind that to the world at large, Hollywood always was the producer of mass mainstream culture. But the gap between LA and New York, therefore, was partly a gap between what New York viewed as frivolous. It's where you went to sell out in LA. It's where writers wrote direct so they could afford to, then go home and write their novel for a year. And yes, the 90s mark a change in that. And you're right. People like Mike Davis writing about LA gives the city a kind of cultural legitimacy that it hasn't had. But also LA evolved politically in the 90s in response to the chaos of the first half of the 90s that really put it on the map in different ways. And this is largely a story that Fernando was told too, about really the rise of a kind of Latino working class finally finding itself, finding an identity, and finding some power. And the reaction against 187, which I want to remind people, this was a ballot measure that for all the anti-immigrant junk you hear in the Republican Party today, there was a certain extremism in Prop 187 that we almost have tended to suppress. One of the reasons why all those high school kids that Fernando talked about were demonstrating was not only did it deny the usual range of public services to undocumenteds, but it said those kids couldn't go to school. They couldn't go to K-12 school. So, I mean, the severity of this was absolutely astonishing. An embattled Republican governor, Pete Wilson, who needed to do something to bolster his reelection chances, made a big deal about running on this. And then it was the backlash to this that really, that's one of two things. The backlash to this that really changed LA politically. After it passed, and various courts rather quickly struck down most of its provisions, but this was the first time that you got a new generation of Latino activists, I think, going into politics. And it was also the time, very significantly, when the labor movement in LA suddenly had Latino leaders, of whom the most significant was a guy named Miguel Contreras, after whom a school is named not too far from here, who realized that the labor movement, which had a lot of Latinos in it, could be a vehicle of political mobilization, not just for its own members, but for the Latino community writ large. And you began to see the political transformation of Los Angeles. LA, had been sort of, just get into the political details for 1 minute. LA had been solidly Democratic at its core. There's no question about that. But if you went around LA County, all the peripheries of LA County, those were districts largely white, not necessarily Jewish, that still elected Republicans. By 1998 and then 2000, they were all gone. There were enough Latinos in that district, there was enough political mobilization, that the whole political complexion of Los Angeles and then Southern California and then California as a whole changed. That's where California went from being a purple state to a blue state. And that's when you got a level of political dynamism and political creativity that really, as you talk about LA being culturally significant, became politically significant for the country. There was an organization, the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, that really invented living wage ordinances and community benefit agreements whereby when somebody wants to build major development in a city, they've got to hire locally. These sorts of things have been adopted in cities across the country now. Cities are now a much more distinctly liberal constituency than the country as a whole. But it began in LA, and that was new. Civic left innovation hadn't really been what you associated Los Angeles with before. But by the mid-'90s and late '90s, in reaction to that, those changes had come, and it was really a major transformation.
Fernando, Harold's talking about a political dynamism in the '90s, and I recall it really well.
Yeah.
There was this Proposition 187, beyond the legalities of it, was actually just sort of a brutal, ethnic. Beyond the technicalities of a legislation that was later mostly deemed unconstitutional, it was also a big insult, and it was sort of hurtful to have gone through it. And then the reaction was very visceral and emotional in people naturalizing, people voting. So that gave rise to this energy. So you recall tell us a little bit about that vitality you mentioned, and do we have it today? Do you used to feel that you could feel politics in the street of LA in the 1990s?
No, we don't have it today to the same degree, but I think it can come back. I think in 2006 we saw it again with the immigrant rights marches, and we see it a little bit with DACA and things of that nature. But what Harold said is not only that kids wouldn't be able to go to school, the law actually said that teachers had to turn in undocumented students. Yeah. It actually said that nurses at emergency rooms or anywhere else, if you knew that a patient was undocumented, you had to turn them in, or else they would be violating the laws and therefore criminals. So the key thing here about what the narrative about Latino incorporation and Latino empowerment are three things. 187, which mobilizes, not at that moment, because 1994, which is the second thing, is a takeover of Republicans of the state level in 1994, and a takeover of not so much Republicans, but certainly moderates, with Richard Riordan taking over in 1993. So the riots and everything that's happening in the early 1990s in Los Angeles and California delegitimizes the Democratic establishment, including Bradley. Those last 4 years of Tom Bradley were a total disaster, including personally, because he was under a cloud, if many of you remember, because he sat on a board of a bank and city money was being put into that, so he got investigated. He was completely incapable of doing nothing in the last 4 years, not only because of the riots, but a variety of different other factors. And so Democrats are in charge. They get thrown out, state level, federal level, everything. That allows all of a sudden with a clean slate for Latinos then to come and emerge.
Yeah, and term limits helped, by the way.
And term limits, yeah, okay? And then you get all of a sudden Cruz Bustamante as speaker, followed by Antonio, okay? And so that really is because you basically scrape the land and then Latinos emerge, and emerge tremendous. I mean, in the next 10 years, almost every position that they have today, about 80% of those were captured. And then the growth is very little after that. But then the key thing is not only is that coalition with labor, and not just for elected positions, but initiatives. Yeah. The 187 was an initiative against Latinos and against progressives and against the alliance. From then on, though, initiatives become in favor. And that is, in 1997, LA passes an incredible bond, school bond, that allows for the rebuilding of schools. A new high school had not been built in Los Angeles from 1965 to 1997 when that bond had passed, even though LA Unified Student Body had grown to 750,000 school children. Not a single new high school because people weren't willing to vote for that. All right, and so not only it ends up being about $25 billion, $20 to $25 billion that LAUSD residents vote to build new schools, and if you add it all up throughout California, over $150 billion that people vote with that alliance of Latinos, progressives, and the labor movement, and that has a major impact. Second, the MTA. You get all these propositions that happen that then lead to the building of mass transit for a variety of people who can't afford cars, et cetera. And so people miss those initiatives that happen with that alliance. And so while the first part of the 90s were miserable, it destroyed and delegitimized the leadership and allowed for a new leadership, new initiatives, and new alliances, including, what was very clear, what Harold said is that the old unions, especially like aerospace, it's difficult for us to think about it, but LA was 20% union in the 50s, right? Today it's only 10%, and it's actually probably the highest of any city.
Except New York.
Except for New York. So 20%, but who were those union members? They were white, middle-class aerospace workers who voted Republican, right? And so labor, in a sense, gets delegitimized. And then they get put back together with Latinos, Latino immigrants, and progressive issues, which, you see the manifestation today with minimum wage and a variety of different other issues.
Dr. Boyd, there was both Harold and Fernando are talking about a time in which there was a lot of talk about this becoming a sort of a post-Anglo city. At the moment, there was a lot of talk about we lost large numbers of whites. We were talking about the emergence of a potential Latino majority at the time. You are a scholar of popular culture, and I'm wondering if you could take us into how the LA both depicted itself from this sort of in many ways, projecting a Beverly Hills 90210 to becoming a city that actually had one of my favorite examples of. Do you ever see the movie City of the remake of Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire? Mm-hmm. Did you see it? There was like not one non-white person in it. Mm. It was unbelievable. It was City of Angels, right? Yeah. Unbelievable. It was supposed to be like a love story to Los Angeles in the way that Wim Wenders made a love story to Berlin. But so how did LA begin, or did it begin, to start depicting itself as much more racially and ethnically complex since the 90s?
Well, I think, you can think about film, for instance. And if you, as my girl here would say.
There you go. All right now. Thank you.
If you go back to '88, when Straight Outta Compton is released, it's, you know, people talk about NWA, but NWA really was that one album, because after that, Ice Cube went solo, and Ice Cube, who is very much from LA, goes to New York to team up with the Bomb Squad in New York, who's producing Public Enemy, and puts out his solo record. So he's a LA artist with this real New York sound. So NWA from that point forward becomes something very different. The transition, however, from '88 to '92 is the transition from Straight Outta Compton to Dr. Dre's The Chronic. So Dr. Dre is the producer of all the NWA songs. Ice Cube's the writer. They're the most important pieces. They eventually go their separate ways. And so from that, you also get the energy, I would say, that produced a film like Boys in the Hood, another film a few years later like Menace to Society, which really garners a lot of attention at the time because it's representing, you know, the influence of what I call the crack era. So crack cocaine, the increased emphasis on gang activity. I could also throw in a film like American Me, you know, which is from 1992, not as well known as these others, but of course very significant. Edward James Olmos, who of course became this really, you know, visible figure during and after the riots. But during this same period of time, you also have, you know, Robert Altman doing Shortcuts, or a few years later, Paul Thomas Anderson doing Boogie Nights, which is set in the Valley, or that terrible Michael Douglas movie.
Oh, what do you mean? That was a great movie.
That movie, I can't even remember the name of it. I remember his name.
The Last Line?
Defense, his name, like, yes, exactly.
The Last Line? No. You mean, I'm the bad guy?
That's the last, you remember this.
Unbelievable. Go on.
You committed this to memory.
Oh, you identify with that character?
No, I saw him.
Okay.
No.
I was like...
Back to you, Dr. Boyd.
I think, you know, the sort of idea of LA as the center in some ways of culture in America, and to talk about Hollywood, you know, it's one thing to talk about Hollywood in the 50s and 60s. It's something else to talk about Hollywood in the 70s. To talk about it in the 90s, it's this really sort of interesting period where you have, you know, these huge sort of technologically specific blockbusters, Jurassic Park and stuff like this, which is whack. But at the same time, you have a movie like, you know, I'll reference Altman again, like The Player, which is a sort of critique, and then Shortcuts a few years later, which is The Valley, and then Paul Thomas Anderson dealing with the Valley, but from the perspective of the porn industry. All of this is LA. And so I think what you saw in film and then in music, LA as a sort of destination, but also as a unique identity, the emergence of West Coast hip hop, which more often than not was LA as opposed to the Bay Area. And the way in which, you know, the language of, say, gang culture seeps into, you know, popular discourse, the way in which the slang from gangster rap starts to become, you know, commonplace. At a point that some, you know, so many years later, like last summer, Straight Outta Compton, the film, makes over $200 million because now it's safe. It's nostalgic. But at that time, the elements that make up that film were actually taking place in the streets. And so it's one thing to sit here now and look back on it fondly, but it's another thing to have lived in the midst of it.
Helen, how did artists respond to these crisis after crisis, and did it make itself, these crises manifest itself in their work or not? And also the social and political changes, are they manifested anywhere in the LA art scene in the 90s?
It's interesting to think about it. Of course, having just organized the exhibition at the Geffen, which is the art of the 90s from MOCA's collection. So that's the lens that I have been looking at the 90s art production in Los Angeles from. There's only one artwork in the collection, and it's in the show, that makes any mention of the events of 1992. And it's by an artist who is living and working in New York, and it's a piece about, she's an African-American artist, and it's a piece about a white German critic's obsession with precisely the music you're discussing, with basically black rap from LA. So you've got like a couple of leapfrogs, right, away from anyone here doing anything about the work, about the situation around Rodney King per se. Now, that's an interesting moment as a curator or as an art historian, because that is an indication of two things. One is the way in which traumatic events, by their very nature, stand outside of language and prohibit a kind of, response to them. That's one of the things a trauma does, right? Is it cuts you off from yourself. It cuts you off from language. So we see, for instance, very few artists in New York dealing explicitly with the events of 9/11, right? It's just, you kind of can't get to it. It's too close. It's too hard. So that's one way of accounting for the absence of that kind of material in MOCA's collection. Of course, the other way of accounting for the absence of that material in MOCA's collection is to talk about how museum personnel and museum life and cultural life in the 90s had yet to fully incorporate the critique of identity politics that had begun by artists in the 80s, and that this was still an extremely white institution concerned with problems of whiteness that could never have been said like that, right? Because they were just the problems of culture. And so that kind of retrospective gaze is distorting in that way. When we look back at the 90s, we can't help but, look back at it through the frame of our current moment. It's tricky that way. To really account for the sort of profound absence. But on the other hand, it doesn't surprise me. The dominant film that trafficked, that artists and people like myself looked at and watched and talked about and thought about all the time in the 90s was actually Blade Runner, which is a film in which no people of color appear, right? It's a kind of dystopic version of the future in which whiteness reigns supreme. And so, that inability to navigate what we would then in the 2000s call, questions of difference, or, the politics of representation, is trenchant in this institution, certainly, and I think in the 90s art world in LA in many ways. Mm-hmm.
Harold, Helen just said, this is sort of implicit in tonight's discussion, is we can't help but look back without seeing it through the frame of the reference of now. And you haven't lived here in 15 years, but you come back every once in a while. And you're sort of a homeboy. You are an Angelino for life.
Right.
What's different about LA? What's better? What do you see is better? What do you miss? What's the city's promise now that it didn't have last time you lived here?
Well, I left here with my unerring sense of timing. I moved to Washington, D.C. about 3 weeks before 9/11. Much like Dr. Boyd moved here right after the 92 riot. So don't consult either of us if you're planning on moving somewhere anytime soon. The city seems to have, for better and worse, I think, less of an edge than it had then. Living with an edge isn't always that comfortable. There was a sense of momentum, and I think Fernando expressed this. There was a sense of momentum around political transformation and the Latino community, which had been here, forever, virtually, but which had been as subordinated community, as you can imagine, in Los Angeles, coming into its own, and not in a nationalistic way at all. That was, I thought, always one of the more positive effects of the alliance with the rising Latino community and the labor community, such that a community like what was then the 13th City Council District in the late 90s could elect to the City Council a lefty Jewish lesbian named Jackie Goldberg. Yeah. Obviously, we have Jackie Goldberg groupies here.
They're everywhere.
In a district that had substantial Latino population, but where the labor movement, dealing with its Latino members and others, said, look, you want a really pro-labor person who's really going to help your material and more than material lives, you got to vote for Jackie Goldberg, and they did, and it was Jackie Goldberg who authored the pioneering living wage ordinance, which really was a major transformation of urban politics ultimately around the whole country. There's a kind of edge then that I don't really detect now, a kind of a sense of momentum that the city, having been through every form of known hell in the early 90s, and a few unknown forms as well. I mean, just the daily TV barrage of the OJ trial was not anything that anyone could have wildly dreamed up, yet there it was. That was an odd moment when I was the interim editor as a whole of the LA Weekly and trying to figure out what the hell is the alternative way of covering the OJ trial when it is saturation everywhere. I decided we would only cover its politics and just, there was nothing else to be said. But, recovering from all of this, I think there was a certain sense of bouncing back. There was also, a sense that we were living through this odd aftermath, which Fernando gave a very good outline of the old order. Tom Bradley was gone. The old Democratic Party was gone. Everyone knew that Richard Riordan, who I bet a lot of people here simply don't remember, which is fine. Everyone knew that Richard Riordan, the Republican mayor of Los Angeles, was an interregnum figure. You knew this was kind of the intermission before the next chapter of Los Angeles life, which did indeed come after he was term limited out. I just don't get a sense of a kind of momentum and edge today. I mean, I'm mainly in D.C., but that's my sense.
Fernando, again, what's better? What do you miss? And what's the big difference between the 90s and now in Los Angeles?
Well, every once in a while, I miss smog. And when we do have a smoggy day, and you get that coming through your lungs and you feel it, it's like one of the greatest things for me because it reminds me of my childhood playing in the playground.
It's a Proustian experience.
Yeah. So
when you have the smog, yes. Okay.
Right. What was interesting in the 90s, I could not have. I mean, today the LA County is the largest Asian county in the country. It's the largest Latino county in the country as well. It's actually, by just quirk of the way we count things, it's also the largest white county in America.
Right. It's the largest county in America.
It's the largest county. That's right. But we've created an incredible, I could not have imagined that, today I would say that we've seen the end of white flight. Whites just are no longer leaving.
Well, they're coming back in.
Yeah, and then coming back in.
Right.
The other interesting demographic aspect is we're one of the few metropolitan areas where the demographics of the county and the city are almost identical. Right. Detroit and Wayne County, not the case. More so today, but remember, I went to the University of Michigan for my PhD. You literally, when you would cross the border of Detroit.
That's not Detroit.
Yeah.
That's Ann Arbor.
I know that, but I'm just saying, when I would go visit the only place I could get good tacos and go watch a baseball game or something, you'd go into Detroit and you could literally see the difference between the suburbs and the city. Yeah. And walking into Tiger Stadium, that it was like, this is a black city. It was all white at the baseball game. It was like you threw these weird things at you. But I think there's the end of white flight. There's the end of Mexican immigration, but there's not the end of Asian immigration. While there's the end of white flight, I don't think there's the end of African Americans leaving this city. what people forget in terms of multiculturalism, I like to talk about as the multicultural myth of Los Angeles. We begin with the story of Olvera Street and the pobladores and how mixed they were. It's great, and then we come to today. And
the mayor likes to say that.
Yeah, it's a great narrative, but nothing could be further from the truth. This is the whitest major American city that has ever existed.
The white spot.
Yeah. In the 1900 census, if you count all census in the whole entire history, and you take a look at only cities of 100,000 or more, this LA was the most white, non-immigrant, non-Hispanic, non-Jewish city that has ever existed in the history of urban America. Okay? And so there's this myth of multiculturalism, right? And then you have this myth that Latinos have always been a power here. And in the 1960s, the 1960 census, there were twice as many blacks as Latinos. Right. When you think of minorities in LA throughout most of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's a black minority city, not a Latino minority city, right? And so that when Latinos start to arrive, it's not only about surpassing whites, it's also dealing with black mobilization that has already occurred. And so that's the major challenge. And so people always talk about how long it took Latinos to gain political power. It's actually, in urban history, really quick when you think about citizens in terms of really not being citizens until the 80s and then that 90s power. The thing that is another major change is economic disparity. At least growing up, there was the myth that there wasn't as much economic disparity, and the numbers, while there was disparity, is nowhere near of what's happening today. Right. I say that no American city is creating more millionaires today than LA, but also no American city is creating more people, poor people than LA. And that's an incredible disparity that it's not part of the LA narrative until really today that you see that. So there are all those different changes that I compared today to the 90s. One last thing that I'll leave you with is that LA is an incredibly, incredibly optimistic town. We do a survey at Loyola Marymount University every year in January. It's the largest general social survey in Los Angeles. It's actually the largest general social survey in urban America. We interview 2,400 residents, okay? Oversample African Americans, oversample certain geographic areas, and we ask a variety of different questions. We kind of have an optimism index, and it's just off the charts when you compare it to the national perspective, how optimistic Angelinos are across the board.
Is it the water?
Lack of water. And you see, and also some other characteristics about that is that Latinos and Asians are more optimistic than whites and blacks. And then amongst Latinos and Asians, foreign-born are more optimistic than U.S.-born. And then we also ask this question for fun that we've asked every time: do you consider yourself an Angelino? Okay? And 78% of people in LA County consider themselves an Angelino. In the city of LA, it's over 80%. And so there's an incredible identity of people saying, and then we ask them the question, would you recommend your neighborhood for people to move into? 85%, irrespective of what your neighborhood is. Brentwood or Compton or Eagle Rock or what have you, people recommend those neighborhoods. And it's a very different narrative of how people view LA. And when you ask people themselves, how do you view LA?
Dr. Boyd, do you call yourself an Angelino, and would you recommend your neighborhood to? No, just kidding. What is the big difference between the 90s?
I was going to answer that.
Answer
ahead.
That, and
go
then answer
ahead.
this other
Go
question
ahead.
of the difference between the LA that you arrived in the 90s and now, but for better or for worse.
I mean, it's to think about that question. In a lot of ways, I think about where we're at as we speak, downtown Los Angeles. As someone from Detroit who grew up in downtown Detroit, I was used to high rises. And, you know, there are high rises all over Detroit. There are places that aren't high rises, but the high rises, like, you know, in New York or Chicago, like, it's sort of a, you know, part of the landscape. You expect to see high rises and some, or at least I did, some centralized notion of downtown. I remember the first time I came to LA, which was maybe, so if I moved here in 92, I came here first in 91. And I was staying at the hotel across the street from USC, which has been multiple brands since that time, and I don't even know if I know what it is now, Radisson maybe. And so first of all, I'm like, okay, I'm in LA, and I had this image in my mind of LA, which was very different than what LA actually was. So I'm like, okay, I guess I need to hail a cab. In those days, you know, before Uber, right? Like, okay, so after 20 minutes or half hour and no cabs, I figured this out. Okay, you got to go call a cab, and calling a cab is weird. Where do you go? And so I get in a cab, and, you know, I'm one of these people. I go to New York. I get in a cab with a cab driver. We might talk about 3 million things between where he picks me up and where I get dropped off, and recommend. It's like a cultural thing. I'm expecting some conversation. I get in a cab here in LA, and it's like crickets. It's like silence. And this guy who's driving is like of no help. And I'm like, you know, look, man, I'm here and I've never been here, and I just want to go like hang out and see shit, like, and walk around, and like, I don't know what I want to do. I don't, you know, like, I want to see LA. And he's like, well, there's a place downtown called the Wells Fargo Center. I don't know, maybe it's like an arena. You know, this is around the time arenas start to take on corporate names. You know, the Great Western Forum, like maybe it's like the Great Western Forum. And he brings me to downtown LA. And he takes me to the Wells Fargo building. And what is now Nick and Steph's was a restaurant that I can't even remember the name of anymore. They had ferns, that's all I remember. It's like an old school fern bar. And I'm like, okay, this is not what I wanted, but the cab's gone. I like clothes. I find my way to Los Angeles Street. I'm home now because it's like, okay, I can walk up and down the street and shop. I'm good, you know? Turned out to be a great experience. Met a tailor who, when I moved back to LA, was like, you know, my tailor. And if you're a dude like me, having a tailor is like having a doctor. It's necessary. But I just remember like how amazed I was at how barren downtown Los Angeles was. It was not centralized, and there really was not much going on at all. Some years after moving here, I decided to move to downtown LA. Why? Because I saw high-rises. It felt like home. This is where I need to be, and it's close enough to USC. I don't have to, you know, drive all over the place. And at the time, people would say to me, oh, you're moving. Where are you moving to? I said, downtown. And they look at me like I was crazy. Either that or they had like pity in their face, like, why would you do that? And I'm like, well, I see something that you don't see. And so that thing I saw now, okay, so coming here tonight, I have to drive from USC. Now, when I first moved downtown, driving from USC downtown, I clocked it, 7 minutes. And that's if you didn't catch any, you know, if you caught lights. If you didn't catch any lights, it might be 5. Now, if you get down here in a half hour, you should feel blessed. I mean,
game, how much is it?
No, come on, you gotta,
it doesn't matter.
It
doesn't matter.
You got to go on the other side of the 110 and come up Broadway or Hill or something.
I've done all that. I've done all that. It's still not. It's still. I've done all that. It's still not. I don't get on the freeway. It's still not short. Right. There's like no place to go. It's a straight line. Laker game, Clipper game, King. It doesn't matter. My point.
Out of the playoffs. You don't have to worry about that.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether the playoffs, if the Staples Center is empty or not. It's that, you know, I mean, roads across the street. We're at MOCA. There are multiple restaurants there. Like, this has become the hottest part of LA. So to go from it being barren and nothing to it being crowded with traffic, but also multiple cultural options, multiple dining options, like, to have witnessed this and to have had it grow up around me, I think is one of the most interesting changes to LA. I always say I don't follow trends, trends follow me. So I move downtown and then it changes the way I see it. Right. But I think that's probably, for me, one of the biggest differences from when I first moved.
So that means we don't ask Harold about life changes, but do ask Dr. Boyd.
There you go.
Helen, 90s versus now in the art scene in this institution that you've been here for about a year and a half, and Todd is talking about LA, downtown LA as being a vital place. What? Tell us.
Well, I mean, LA's, I think, still most significant contribution in terms of the ecology of the art world is that because there wasn't an art market here for so long, what came to dominate the scene in Los Angeles were the art schools. So you had Otis and Art Center in UCLA and the legendary Cal Arts. And that quality of the LA art world persists, and it does so with a kind of tenacity now in the face of a rising, an extremely robust, I mean, all of the development that you're talking about in downtown is also happening in the gallery scene in Los Angeles. I mean, there's an incredible amount of influx of galleries from outside and growth of quote unquote native galleries here. But I think that, that long pull, the sort of deep DNA of the LA art scene being related to the art schools still is operative. And I think that's something to really, to think about and to hold, to try and hold on to. Obviously, everything grows and changes over time, but that quality of what LA offers, there's no other city, whether it's London or Berlin or New York or the sort of major art centers, there's no other art center that has that particular cast to itself. And that is, I think, one of the reasons that LA has sort of become the art center that it has and that it is now.
And you're expecting more growth? You're optimistic?
I am. I mean, what can I say, man? I don't live in New York. I live here because here is where it's at right now.
Yeah, one big difference is journalism and public discourse. So in the 1990s, remember Which Way LA started as a response to the riots,
which just
ended. Life and Times, remember that from KCET, and that ended about 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. You take a look at the LA Weekly. It's a shadow of itself about that then, not to mention the LA Times and La Opinión. One of the stories that we constantly hear about the LA Times is how it's been bought by different companies and et cetera, et cetera. The exact same thing has happened to La Opinión, and most people don't realize that when you don't read it. And then you take a look at local news. Channel 5 and Channel 9 used to be pretty good at local news, et cetera. Not anymore. And so that's a big difference. There's not a set of discussion points where everybody was involved. There's a lot more of this, though. A lot more of this that's happening in a different spots and different sectors. But that overwhelming countywide or citywide discussion is just not happening.
And this is a city that, for geographic and cultural and racial and other reasons, has often been profoundly invisible to itself. In a way, that's changed because we're talking about really the rise of a certain civic consciousness here, but the erosion of journalism, which is a national phenomenon. But it's bad for particular cities. It's real bad here.
Yeah.
Well, but some of that also is because of the shift from analog to digital.
Right.
And
that's true.
You're talking about newspapers as opposed to online presence.
Yeah,
so
there are some. Like KPCC, I think that's incredible news coverage. Yeah. Full disclosure, I'm on that board. But
on that note, I'm getting stared at. That we have to. I just want to end. You've all been really great, really fascinating remarks. I think we can conclude that while the 90s had an edge and a sense of momentum, it was not LA's golden era. So that is our response and conclusion for the night. Thank you to our amazing guests. Thank you.
Todd Kerner. One of my memories from the 90s was, I think it was New Jack City opened, and there were some problems in Westwood Village. And I don't think Westwood Village has ever really recovered from that. And I wonder if you could explain perhaps why that is.
Well, what happened was, this is the sort of stuff that gets lost in history, but there were, activities happening at the screening of the film. That particular case you mentioned in Westwood was a situation where the theater actually, oversold the tickets. But because of the content of the movie, people tried to make some association with the content of the movie and violence occurring. But you're right, Westwood started to develop a reputation because of so many theaters being there that it was no longer necessarily the safest place to go and watch movies. And with movies like New Jack City and Boys in the Hood, there was this sort of racial subtext that you can find if you go back to the beginnings of the earliest days of cinema. There was always this assumption that Black people, minorities, weren't smart enough to know that what they were watching was on screen and instead tried to sort of act it out, which I think informs that. But what happens over time is that Westwood, which had been sort of an entertainment destination, starts to lose some of that distinction, I think, that you could maybe track back to, that film and the story, which got national coverage.
And it never recovered. Yeah. But it's not unusual in LA because it's so dispersed that you would have commercial centers exhaust themselves. And I would say that Westwood was about to exhaust itself anyway in terms of its rents, et cetera. And that in LA, there's so many more options of creating a center until now that we have downtown. Whereas in New York,
Promenade took off right around.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So I think that was a part that was a particular situation, but the trend was there. I think that was going
Melrose
to occur.
Was the 90s.
Well,
too,
I think the thing is that incident drew so much attention, but it really didn't have that much to do with what was already taking place.
Right.
I wasn't living in LA in the 90s, but I can remember reading about the homelessness crisis in Los Angeles. Since living here in 2006, that has only gotten worse, and with rents becoming what they are, it doesn't look like that situation is going to improve anytime soon. I'm wondering if anyone wants to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I remember there were things like an encampment at the beach in the late 80s. It was dispelled. Most cities don't know how to handle this. Cities with warmer weather tend to be places where homelessness is certainly more visible. But I mean, right today, LA is, according to Zillow, the city in which people spend the highest percentage of their income on rent. I mean, we think of San Francisco and New York perhaps as the places where rent has been unaffordable, but we continually miss just how low so many Angelenos' income actually is and how unaffordable the city is. I remember back at the Weekly in the mid-90s looking at some of the census data that, you began to see in that period with the immigrant influx and others, a huge number of people living completely illegally in single-family home garages. I don't think the census ever quite reflected how many people were. But no, this is an ongoing crisis for most cities that haven't been just completely depopulated because of the absence of funding for affordable housing. But it was acute in the city then, and I suspect it's more acute in the city now, at least compared to other American cities based on the national statistics.
Yeah, but the official response, though, is dramatically different. In the 90s, the official response was to physically remove homeless, to arrest homeless, to not even consider them on all kinds of different issues. Today, the official response is dramatically different, and I think that's a significant difference between the 90s and today. That public policy is much more thoughtful for a variety of different reasons. So, when we do the polling and we ask what are the major issues, number one is affordable housing, number two is homelessness, and number three is economic disparity. And people are very well acute of the challenge of homelessness.
That's going to conclude our program. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Our co-presenter, the Museum of Contemporary Art, MOCA, we're so happy to be here. I want to invite you all to join us upstairs. All of our panelists will be there. Grab a drink, ask them some more questions, and enjoy the show. Thank you so much.